A virgin Amish man, hidden deep in the snow-covered mountains, thought the world had forgotten him. But one freezing night, 5 bleeding widows appear at his door, half dead, desperate, and hunted. He opens his home to save them, not knowing that one carries proof of a crime that could destroy everything he believes in. Inside that tiny cabin, faith collides with fear, mercy with vengeance, and a secret bullet on the mantel could damn an innocent man. When the storm clears, the widows discover the truth. His own brother led the men who killed their husbands. Now the man who swore never to fight must choose, hold to peace or protect the helpless. As the church bell tolls over a valley stained by sin and snow, can a man who never touched a woman save 5 broken souls without losing his own? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The wind howled like a wounded beast against Arthur Stoltzfus's cabin walls. He sat alone in his usual evening silence, watching his Bible's pages flutter in the draft that snuck through the log chinks. The leather-bound book lay open to Psalms, though the words blurred as his tired eyes struggled in the dim lamplight. The pounding at his door came so suddenly it made him jump, scattering his reading glasses onto the rough-hewn floor. At first he thought it was just another gust of the February storm. But then he heard it again. Desperate fists hammering against wood, accompanied by muffled cries that made his heart skip. Arthur hesitated, one hand on his lamp. In 8 years of solitude, no one had ever sought his cabin after nightfall. The Amish way was to live apart from the world's troubles. Yet something in those cries spoke of real desperation. "Please," a woman's voice carried through the howling wind. "Help us." His conscience wouldn't let him ignore their pleas. Arthur lifted the iron latch, and the door burst inward with the force of the storm. 5 women tumbled across his threshold in a tangle of skirts and shawls, bringing with them a swirl of snow and the metallic scent of blood. "Ach, du Lieber," he exclaimed, his Pennsylvania Dutch slipping out in shock. The women collapsed onto his plank floor, their clothes torn and frozen stiff. One clutched a bleeding arm, another's face was marked with ugly purple bruises. Arthur stood frozen for a moment, his modest nature warring with the clear need before him. These were women alone, in his home, at night. It went against everything proper. But they were also God's children in desperate straits. "Be still now," he said softly, reaching for his thickest quilts. "You're safe here." The youngest woman, barely more than a girl with copper-bright hair, tried to speak through chattering teeth. They ambushed our wagon, in the valley. Shot James." Her words dissolved into racking sobs. Arthur moved quickly then, his large hands gentle, as he helped them closer to the pot-bellied stove. He added fresh logs until the iron belly glowed cherry red, then set his biggest copper pot of snow to melt for broth. "I'm Clara Jenkins," said a stern-faced woman with graying hair, who seemed to have taken charge of the others. "This here's Nora Callahan, Liddy Parker, Ruth Moreno, and Alaya Yazzie." She gestured to each in turn, ending with a quiet Navajo woman who held herself apart, watching Arthur with wary eyes. "Arthur Stoltzfus," he replied simply, measuring out dried chicken and herbs for the broth. The familiar motions of cooking helped steady his shaking hands. As he worked, their story emerged in bits and pieces. They were all widows now, their husbands killed in what seemed a planned attack on their wagon as they'd traveled to file homestead papers. The women had fled up the mountain in the growing storm, following a trail Ruth remembered from her herb gathering. "The Lord guided your feet here," Arthur said quietly, passing out tin cups of steaming broth. This storm would have been your death otherwise. Liddy Parker, the one with the bruised face, gave a bitter laugh. Seems to me the Lord wasn't paying much attention when those men murdered our husbands. Arthur saw Nora, the young redhead, flinch at the words. Ruth Moreno crossed herself and murmured what sounded like a prayer in Spanish. I don't pretend to know God's ways, Arthur said carefully, but I know he led you to shelter this night. He moved among them with bandages and his precious store of witch hazel, cleaning cuts and binding sprains as best he could. His hands remembered the motions from long ago, when he'd helped tend cholera victims in his community, before the fever had taken his parents and his beloved Sarah, before he'd fled west to escape his grief. The night passed in a blur of quiet ministrations. Arthur kept the stove fed and the broth flowing, listening as the women's frozen bodies slowly warmed and their shock ebbed into exhaustion. Their soft voices and occasional tears filled his cabin with sounds he hadn't heard in years. Near dawn, he found himself at his table, watching them sleep wrapped in his quilts. Alaya Yazi had finally allowed him to bind her bleeding arm, though she'd insisted on using her own herbs. Now she slept sitting upright against the wall, her dark eyes moving beneath closed lids. The storm still raged outside, but inside, his home felt suddenly different. The walls that had sheltered his solitude now protected these 5 broken lives. Their presence brought an ache to his chest, part discomfort, part something else he couldn't name. Arthur picked up his fallen Bible, smoothing its pages. The lamp's light caught the words of Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He looked again at the sleeping women and whispered a prayer for strength. Whatever came next, he knew his life of isolation had ended with that. Knock upon his door. Morning crept into Arthur's cabin like a timid guest, filtering through frost-rimed windows. The pale light revealed what darkness had hidden, the women's faces drawn with exhaustion, their clothes stained with blood and dirt from their desperate flight. Arthur stood at his iron stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush. His movements were careful, measured, as if afraid to disturb the strange quiet that had settled over his home. The familiar crackle of the fire and the soft bubbling of the pot seemed somehow different with others present. Ruth Moreno was the first to stir. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to caring for others, checking on her companions before approaching Arthur at the stove. Let me help, she offered, her voice gentle. I see you have yarrow drying there. Good for wounds. She gestured to the herbs hanging from his rafters. Arthur nodded, stepping aside to give her room. He noticed how she watched him from the corner of her eye, taking in his plain black clothing and the way he kept his distance. You have healing knowledge? He asked softly. See, I was midwife on our wagon train. Ruth reached for the yarrow with practiced hands. And you? Where did you learn? My mother taught me. Before... He trailed off, turning back to the pot. Nora Callahan sat up from her bedroll, copper hair tangled around her face. Before what? Her direct gaze made Arthur shift uncomfortably. Why does an Amish man live alone up here? The other women were awakening now, drawn by the smell of food and the sound of conversation. Clara Jenkins smoothed her gray-streaked hair, watching Arthur with shrewd eyes as he struggled to find words. I was born to the old order in Lancaster County, he began, ladling mush into wooden bowls. 8 years ago, cholera came through our settlement, took my parents, and Sarah, my betrothed. He passed out the bowls, careful not to let his fingers brush against any of theirs. Afterward, I couldn't bear the empty places at meeting, the pitying looks. I had a cousin out here who'd left the faith. Thought I might join him, but he gestured vaguely at his plain clothes, his unadorned cabin. Found I couldn't leave the old ways behind after all. So you've been alone all this time? Clara asked, her stern face softening slightly. Arthur nodded, taking his own bowl to the far end of the table. Until now. Until we brought trouble to your door, Nora said bitterly. Her spoon clinked against her bowl as her hand trembled. Like those men brought trouble to us. Tell him, Ruth urged softly. He deserves to know what danger he's sheltering. Clara straightened her shoulders. We were 5 families, heading to file homestead claims in the valley. Had all the proper papers, mind you, but seems some big ranchers didn't want small farmers cutting up their grazing land. They came at sunset, Nora continued, her voice hollow. Shot the men first, our husbands, then set fire to the wagons with all we owned inside. Her knuckles whitened around her spoon. If Ruth hadn't known about this mountain trail. Arthur's hands clasped together in silent prayer. The women's words painted images he'd tried to leave behind. Violence, death, the world's cruel ways reaching even into this peaceful place. You're safe here, he said finally, though the words felt inadequate. Clara studied his spare cabin, the single chair, the solitary cup hook, the narrow bed now pushed against the wall. Everything spoke of a life lived alone, ordered by habit and prayer. Are you certain? She asked. Having 5 strange women under your roof, it can't be proper by your standards. Arthur's cheeks flushed. God's law of charity comes before all else. But he couldn't meet their eyes, and his discomfort was plain to see. Ruth laid a gentle hand on Clara's arm. He's right, and he's a good man. You can see it in how he tends his home, his herbs, how he helped us without question. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Fresh snow swirled past the glass, thick enough to blur the world beyond. We'll be trapped here, Nora realized aloud. Days at least, maybe weeks. She looked at Arthur, who stood awkwardly by his cold forge. And you haven't spoken to a woman in years, have you? He shook his head, the motion barely visible. Not beyond trading for supplies in town, once a season at most. A heavy silence filled the cabin as the reality of their situation settled over them. These 5 women, fresh from violence and loss, dependent on the charity of a man who could barely meet their eyes. And Arthur himself, his carefully ordered solitude shattered by their desperate need. The snow fell steadily outside, sealing them all together in this unlikely sanctuary. As evening settled over the cabin, Arthur moved quietly among his sleeping guests. The women had succumbed to exhaustion, their bodies curled beneath borrowed quilts near the warmth of the stove. He gathered the breakfast bowls with careful hands, trying not to let them clatter. The familiar routine of tidying brought him comfort. Arthur wiped each wooden bowl clean with a cloth, hung them on their pegs, and swept the rough-hewn floorboards with slow, methodical strokes. The simple acts helped calm his racing thoughts about the strange circumstances God had brought to his door. A floorboard creaked. Arthur turned to find Nora standing by the fireplace, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She was studying something on his mantel, her face tightening with recognition. Where did you get this? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the cabin's quiet like a knife. Arthur set his broom aside. Get what? Nora's hand trembled as she held up a spent brass bullet casing that had been resting among his few mantel ornaments, a carved wooden horse, a smooth river stone, a dried pine cone. This cartridge, she said. It has the same maker's mark as the ones we found. Her voice caught. As the ones from the ambush. The word ambush seemed to wake the other women. Clara sat up first, then Ruth, their faces alert with fresh fear. Liddy and Elia stirred moments later, drawing closer together as they sensed the tension. I do not understand, Arthur said, his brow furrowed. He stepped forward, then stopped as Nora flinched back. That casing, I found it perhaps 3 weeks ago, when some men from town brought a horse for me to repair its bridle. Men from town, Clara's voice was sharp. What men? Arthur spread his hands helplessly. I did not ask their names. It is not our way to pry. They were strangers to me, passing through. The casing was in the dirt by my forge after they left. I thought it interesting. He looked down at his feet. We do not have such things in our community. Convenient, Nora said, her grief turning to anger. Just like it's convenient you live up here all alone. Perfect spot to watch the valley trail. Nora, Ruth cautioned, but the younger woman wasn't finished. How do we know you're not working with them? Nora demanded. Maybe you signal them when wagons come through. Maybe. No. Arthur's quiet voice carried such pain that it stopped her mid-sentence. I have never raised my hand against another soul. It is forbidden by our faith and by my heart. Snow whispered against the windows, piling higher in the growing dark. The women huddled together, watching him with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Arthur moved slowly to his forge, his movements deliberate. I will prove my words, he said. He held out his hand for the casing. Let me melt it down. Remove this thing that brings such painful memories to your hearts. After a long moment, Nora placed the brass cylinder in his palm. Arthur nodded his thanks and turned to his forge. With practiced motions, he stoked the coals until they glowed orange in the dimness. The women watched as he placed the casing in a small crucible and set it in the heart of the fire. Minutes passed. The brass began to soften, then melt, until nothing remained but a shapeless blob of metal. Arthur let it cool, then held it up for them to see. I am sorry, he said softly, that even this small thing brought you fresh grief. I should have thrown it away when I found it. Clara's stern face softened slightly. No, we're the ones who should apologize. Fear makes us quick to judge. Fear is natural, Arthur replied, but faith must be stronger. He moved to the center of the room, and with simple dignity, knelt on the wooden floor, his hands clasped together, trembling slightly. Dear Lord, he prayed aloud, his voice quiet but clear, watch over these souls you have brought to my door. Ease their hearts of fear and grief. Guide my hands to help them as you would have me do, and forgive us all our doubts, for they come from our human weakness. The wind moaned outside, driving snow against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove, casting dancing shadows. One by one, the women bowed their heads, letting Arthur's sincere words wash over them. Trust remained fragile between them, like spring ice on a stream. But as Arthur's prayer continued, something else began to grow. A cautious hope that perhaps God had led them to this strange sanctuary for a reason. Days melted together as the snow kept falling, thick and constant. The world beyond Arthur's cabin disappeared beneath a white blanket that grew deeper with each passing hour. Inside, the small home hummed with quiet activity that seemed to push back against winter's chill. Arthur stood in the doorway of his lean-to woodshed, arms loaded with split logs. The familiar weight and rough bark against his hands grounded him. He'd grown used to silence, to the sound of his own breathing and footsteps. Now his home echoed with new sounds. Women's voices, the scrape of chairs, even occasional laughter. He carried the wood inside, stamping snow from his boots. The cabin had changed in just these few days. Clara Jenkins moved about with purpose, her capable hands bringing order to corners long neglected. She'd organized his few dishes, swept away cobwebs, and somehow made the small space feel larger. "Much obliged," Ruth Moreno said, as Arthur added logs to the cooking fire. The warm scent of baking bread filled the air. A miracle Ruth had worked with his simple stores of grain. She shaped the flatbread with practiced movements, humming softly as she worked. "The bread smells good," Arthur said quietly. Such simple words still felt strange in his mouth after years of silence. Ruth smiled. "A gift from my people. Tortillas. They'll fill empty bellies." Across the room, Liddy Parker sat in the circle of lantern light, her needle flashing as she mended one of Arthur's worn shirts. He'd protested when she'd first offered, but she'd insisted. "Can't have you going about in rags," she'd said firmly. The domestic scenes stirred memories Arthur had long buried. His mother's hands kneading dough, his sisters' voices raised in song as they worked. He pushed the thoughts away gently, like laying flowers on a grave. As evening drew near, they gathered around his table, now cleared of his tools and metalwork. Ruth's flatbread passed from hand to hand. The warm circles were a welcome change from the dried meat and beans that had been their fare. Nora sat near the fire, absently running her fingers over the smooth wood of his chair. Without warning, she began to hum, a hymn that pierced Arthur's heart. Amazing grace floated through the cabin, the notes pure and clear. His hands trembled on his cup. Sarah, his betrothed, had loved that hymn. She'd sung it while tending her father's garden, while walking to Sunday service, while helping his mother with preserves. The memory of her voice, silenced by cholera these 7 years past, brought unexpected tears to his eyes. Arthur bowed his head, letting the drops fall, unseen. But Ruth's gentle hand touched his shoulder, offering silent comfort. These women knew grief too well to miss its signs. "I'm sorry," Nora said, stopping mid-verse. "I didn't mean to cause pain." "No," Arthur managed. "The song is beautiful. Please, continue." Nora's voice rose again, and this time Ruth joined her, then Clara. Even Liddy added her voice. The harmony filled every corner of the cabin, making it feel more like a sanctuary than a shelter. Only Alaya remained silent, huddled near the stove. Her face was flushed with fever, her injured hand swollen despite Ruth's careful tending. Arthur noticed her discomfort and rose quietly from the table. He gathered herbs from his stored medicines, yarrow, witch hazel, dried garlic, crushing them together with a mortar and pestle. To these he added a measure of honey and clean snow, working them into a poultice as his mother had taught him long ago. Kneeling beside Alaya, Arthur spoke softly. "May I?" He gestured to her wounded hand. Alaya nodded, her dark eyes watching as he gently wrapped the poultice around the angry flesh. His big, calloused hands moved with surprising delicacy. "Dear Father," he prayed, his voice barely above a whisper, "please ease her pain and drive out the fever, guard her rest and grant her healing." The simple prayer, offered without ceremony or pretense, brought fresh tears to Ruth's eyes. She'd seen many men of faith, but few whose actions matched their words so purely. Outside, a wolf's howl split the night. Another answered, then another, their voices echoing off the snow-covered hills. The sound was a sharp reminder of how far they were from any town or settlement, how dependent they were on this quiet man's charity. But as Alaya relaxed under Arthur's care, as Ruth shaped another batch of bread, as Clara tidied away their supper dishes, the wolves seemed less threatening. Here, in this transformed space, they had found something unexpected. Not just shelter from the storm, but a place where trust could grow again. Liddy threaded her needle for another seam, watching Arthur tend to Elia. Her initial suspicions felt distant now, melted away like snow in sunshine. No man who prayed with such gentle humility, who worked so tirelessly for their comfort, could harbor the violence that had stolen their husbands. The fire crackled in the stove, sending warmth through the cabin. Outside, snow continued to fall, but its silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it wrapped around them like a blanket, giving them time to heal, to trust, to find their way forward together. The storm's fury finally began to ease, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white. Arthur pulled on his heavy coat and boots, checking the leather straps of his snowshoes. He needed to check his trap lines. Their food stores wouldn't last forever with 6 mouths to feed. "Be careful out there," Ruth called from where she worked at the stove. Her concern warmed him like the morning sun. The crisp air bit at his face as he made his way through the deep snow. His thoughts drifted back to the cabin, to the strange new feeling of having others depend on him. The silence of his solitary life had been replaced by something both frightening and precious. He was checking his third trap when he saw it, a thin column of smoke rising above the trees to the south. Arthur's heart quickened. Few travelers ventured this high in winter. The memory of the bullet casing on his mantle made his stomach twist. Moving closer to the tree line, he caught glimpses of distant riders through the branches. 3 men, maybe 4, their shapes dark against the snow. They were too far to make out clearly, but their presence felt wrong, like wolves circling a flock. Arthur hurried back towards the cabin, his mind racing. He'd found 2 rabbits in the traps. Not much, but they'd have to do. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him harder than his laden pack. Inside, he carefully kept his face neutral as he handed the rabbits to Ruth. But his eyes kept straying to the windows, searching for signs of the riders. "Getting mighty low on flour," Liddy observed that afternoon, measuring out what remained. Her directness reminded Arthur of his sisters. "What happens when we run out?" "God will provide," he said softly, though his own worry gnawed at him. "And what about when the snow melts?" Liddy pressed, setting down the flour bin. "Will you send us away then?" The question hung in the air. Arthur's hands stilled on the harness he was mending. I don't know," he admitted. "I've never shared my home before. Never thought to." "You saved our lives," Nora said from her place by the fire. Her green eyes met his with an intensity that made him look away. "We'd have frozen to death if you hadn't opened your door." Heat crept up Arthur's neck, and he ducked his head, focusing on the leather in his hands. Praise sat uncomfortably on his shoulders, like an ill-fitting coat. "The Lord guided your steps here," he murmured. "I just opened the door." Clara smiled at his modesty. Some wouldn't have even done that much. As evening settled over the cabin, Arthur's worry about the riders grew. He added extra logs to the fire, checking and rechecking that the door was securely barred. The women noticed his restlessness, but didn't comment. Later, when the others had gone to sleep, Ruth found him kneeling by the hearth. The firelight played across his features as he prayed, his voice barely a whisper. "Lord, why did you bring them here? To my door, of all places?" His words carried the weight of genuine wrestling. "I'm not fit for this responsibility. I don't know how to help them, how to protect them. Please show me your will." Ruth stood quietly in the shadows, watching this private struggle. After a moment, she moved forward and knelt beside him. Arthur started slightly but didn't rise. "May I pray with you?" she asked softly. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Together they lifted their concerns to heaven, for safety, for guidance, for healing of both body and spirit. Their whispered prayers mingled with the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping women. When they finished, a peace settled over them both. Ruth touched Arthur's shoulder gently before rising. "God's ways aren't always clear to us," she said, "but he doesn't make mistakes." Arthur nodded, drawing comfort from her words and presence. The cabin felt different now, no longer just his shelter from the world, but something new and fragile growing in the midst of winter's grip. Though uncertainty still pressed in like the snow outside, he felt less alone in facing it. Looking around at the sleeping forms of the women, Nora curled in his chair, Liddy and Clara sharing blankets near the stove, Alaya finally resting peacefully, Arthur realized that his home had become more than just a refuge. Something was changing in his heart, melting away years of chosen solitude like spring sun on mountain snow. He banked the fire for the night, his movements quiet and practiced. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, this moment of peace was enough. His silent cabin had become a sanctuary for 6 souls brought together by Providence, and despite his fears, he couldn't help but feel grateful. 3 weeks passed since the storm first drove the widows to Arthur's door. The evening found them gathered around his sturdy table, sharing a simple supper of rabbit stew. The comfortable silence they'd developed was broken by heavy knocking. Arthur rose slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the door's wooden bar. A snow-covered figure stumbled in, bringing a blast of cold air. "Much obliged," the stranger wheezed, pulling back his frost-crusted scarf. "Name's Weber. Been tracking beaver up high. Got caught in this weather." Arthur nodded solemnly, gesturing towards the fire. "Welcome to warm yourself." The trapper's eyes widened at the sight of the 5 women, but he kept his peace. Ruth brought him a bowl of stew while Arthur added logs to the hearth. As the evening deepened, Weber shared news from his travels. "Strange doings down in Settlers Valley," he said, warming his hands. "Railroad men clearing folks off their land. Not just any hired guns, neither. They're led by a peculiar sort. Used to be Amish, if you can credit it." Arthur's spine stiffened. The spoon in his hand clattered against his bowl. "Fellow named Isaac Stoltzfus," Weber continued, oblivious to the tension suddenly filling the room. "Heard tell he left his people years back. Now he's got no mercy for them as won't sell to the railroad. Burned out 3 homesteads last month alone." The widows had gone deathly still. Nora's face drained of color as she stared at Arthur, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Stoltzfus," she whispered. "Like you." Arthur's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "My brother," he said, his voice barely audible. Clara gasped. Liddy pushed back from the table, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Weber glanced between them, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Reckon I've said something I shouldn't." No one slept much that night. The trapper took his leave at first light, clearly eager to be away from the heavy silence that had descended on the cabin. After he'd gone, Arthur stood before the women, his shoulders bowed as if under an invisible weight. "I must tell you the truth," he said. "Isaac is indeed my brother. We were raised together in the faith, but he chose a different path." "Your brother killed our husbands," Nora said, her voice sharp as winter wind. "Led those men who drove us from our homes." Arthur flinched but met her gaze. "His sins are not mine to bear, but I grieve for the pain he has caused you." "Grieving won't restore our land," Liddy cut in. "Will you help us reclaim what's ours?" "The law," Arthur began. "The law?" Nora laughed bitterly. "The railroad owns the law in these parts. Your brother counts on that." Arthur's face showed his inner struggle. "I cannot take up arms. Violence is a sin against God and man. We must trust in proper justice." "Justice?" Clara stood, trembling. "Was it justice when they shot John in the back? When they burned everything we owned?" "My faith teaches—" Arthur tried again. "Your faith?" Nora's voice cracked. "What about our faith? I prayed while I watched my William die. God didn't stop your brother's bullets then." Ruth laid a gentle hand on Nora's arm, but the younger woman shook it off. "I thought you were different," Nora said to Arthur, "but you're just hiding up here safe in your principles while others suffer." Arthur's face showed the blow her words struck, but he remained steady. "I will help you seek legal redress. I will testify to what I know, but I cannot take up weapons, even against my own brother. The path of violence leads only to more violence." The cabin divided then. Liddy and Clara huddled with Nora near the window, their whispered words sharp with disappointment. Ruth and Elia stayed closer to Arthur, understanding in their eyes, even if they didn't fully agree. "You ask us to forgive what cannot be forgiven," Nora said finally, turning to face him. "To trust in a justice that has already failed us." "I ask you to trust in something higher than vengeance," Arthur replied softly. "The same God who led you to my door that night can make a way forward now." "And if he doesn't?" Nora challenged. "If your brother returns to finish what he started?" Arthur's face showed his torment, but his voice remained firm. "Then I will stand between you and harm, but not with a gun in my hand. There are other ways to show strength." The women fell silent, each wrestling with their own thoughts. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beams, while outside the snow continued its slow melt. The peace they'd found in Arthur's cabin lay shattered, replaced by the hard question of how justice and mercy might meet on the unforgiving frontier. The first warm breeze of March whispered through the valley, carrying the promise of spring. Patches of earth emerged from beneath the melting snow like islands in a white sea. Inside Arthur's cabin, the atmosphere had softened along with the weather. Arthur stood at his workbench, demonstrating how to twist grass and tallow into candles. The widows gathered around, their faces intent. "The key is patience," he explained, his hands moving with practiced grace. "Let each layer cool proper before adding the next." Nora watched his fingers work, noting how such large hands could perform such delicate tasks. She'd been struggling with her grief, finding it easier to focus on learning these simple crafts than dwelling on her memories. "Like this?" she asked, holding up her own attempt. Arthur nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting in a gentle smile. These days his smiles came more readily, transforming his solemn face. "You have a natural touch for it." Outside, Ruth called them to help with the fence mending. Arthur had been teaching them how to repair the winter's damage, explaining that good fences meant safety for both animals and people. They worked together, driving posts and stretching wire, their breaths visible in the cool air. "My William never thought to teach me such things," Nora admitted, wrestling with a stubborn post. "Reckoned some tasks were just for men." "All knowledge is a gift from God," Arthur replied, steadying the post for her. "Man or woman were each called to learn and grow." In the evenings, Arthur would read from his worn Bible by lamplight. His calm voice gave the ancient words new meaning, especially the Psalms of lament and hope. Nora found herself drawing closer during these readings, finding comfort in the familiar verses spoken in his steady tone. One evening, Ruth found Nora alone by the window, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You carry too much weight," Ruth said softly, sitting beside her. "I should have done more," Nora whispered. "When they attacked—" "No," Ruth interrupted gently. "God spared you for a purpose. You honor William's memory by living, not by drowning in guilt." Before Nora could respond, excited shouts erupted from the barn. They rushed outside to find one of Arthur's cows had given birth. The calf, wet and wobbling, tried to stand on spindly legs while its mother lowed softly. Arthur knelt in the straw, his face alight with joy. "A miracle," he breathed, helping the calf find its feet. "Every new life is a miracle." The women gathered around, their own faces reflecting his wonder. Even Clara, who'd been the most withdrawn, reached out to stroke the calf's damp fur. They stayed in the barn for hours, watching the new creature take its first steps, sharing in the simple miracle of beginning. The next morning, Arthur announced his intention to build a small chapel on a rise near the cabin. "This land has known pain," he said, marking out the foundation in the thawing earth. "Perhaps it can also know healing." The widows embraced the project with unexpected enthusiasm. Liddy proved skilled at measuring and cutting boards, while Clara revealed a talent for detailed woodwork. They worked together through the warming days, the chapel slowly taking shape against the sky. "Why here?" Nora asked Arthur one afternoon as they fitted a window frame. "Why not closer to town?" Arthur considered before answering. "Sometimes we need to step away from the world to find our way back to God." He paused, then added softly, "And to ourselves." Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, aware of something delicate and new growing between them. It was different from Nora's love for William. Quieter, more contemplative. Different, too, from Arthur's memories of his lost betrothed. This feeling carried the weight of their shared grief, but also the lightness of unexpected joy. Ruth noticed these gentle exchanges and smiled to herself. She saw how Arthur's hand would linger when passing Nora tools, how Nora's voice softened when speaking his name. Their growing affection was like the spring itself, tentative at first, then gradually more certain. The chapel rose steadily, its simple lines clean against the mountain backdrop. Arthur carved a cross for the peak, while the women gathered wildflowers to plant along the path. Together they created something new from their shared loss, a place of peace and remembrance. One evening, as sunset painted the chapel's new walls in gold, Arthur gathered them all inside. The space smelled of fresh-cut wood and spring earth. He read from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." Nora sat near the window, watching how the fading light played across Arthur's face as he read. His voice carried the same steady strength that had welcomed them that stormy night. But now it held something more. Hope, perhaps, or the first whispers of love. The new calf could be heard calling from the barn, its voice strong and sure. Like the chapel, like the growing warmth between Arthur and Nora, it was a sign of life's persistence, of healing's quiet power. Spring had come at last to the high country, bringing with it the promise of renewal. Clara Jenkins had always been methodical in her habits. While helping Nora organize their few belongings one spring morning, she noticed something peculiar about the leather-bound Bible they'd salvaged from the wagon attack. The book's spine seemed oddly thick in one spot. "Nora," she called, running her fingers along the binding. "Come look at this." The others gathered as Clara carefully worked a sealed envelope from where it had been concealed. Her hands trembled as she held it up to the morning light streaming through Arthur's cabin windows. "The deed," Nora breathed, recognition flooding her face. "William must have hidden it here before." Her voice trailed off, unable to finish. Ruth leaned closer, squinting at the carefully penned names. "Look here, all 5 of us. Our husbands made sure we were listed as joint owners." Elia touched the paper reverently. "This is what they died protecting. Proof that the land belongs to us, not the railroad." Clara smoothed the creased document on Arthur's oak table. This could expose Isaac's crimes, show everyone what really happened that night. Arthur stood in the doorway, his face troubled as he listened. The thought of confronting his brother, even through legal means, brought shadows to his eyes. "The sheriff needs to see this," Liddy declared, "once the trail clears enough for travel." "I'll help prepare a wagon," Arthur offered quietly, though tension lined his shoulders. The path down to town should be passable in a day or two. That evening, while the others slept, Nora found Arthur sitting alone by the dying fire. The deed lay between them on the rough wooden table like a physical weight. "You're worried about facing him," she said softly, settling into the chair beside him. Arthur's hands were clasped tightly together. "Isaac was not always as he is now. We shared the same faith once, the same belief in peace. But he chose a different path," Nora reminded him gently. "Aye." Arthur's voice was heavy with old pain. "Yet he is still my brother. I fear what bringing this to light will mean." "The truth must be told," Nora said, touching his arm. "But that doesn't mean it must lead to violence." Arthur covered her hand with his own. "I promised God long ago that I would never raise a weapon against another soul, even for justice." "Then we'll trust in the law," Nora assured him, though doubt flickered in her eyes. "Like you said, God's justice can prevail without guns." The next morning brought preparation for their journey. Arthur inspected the wagon while Clara and Ruth gathered provisions. Liddy packed medical supplies, remembering their last terrible journey through the valley. Aliyah sat cross-legged on a blanket, her nimble fingers working with needle and thread. "The deed will be safer hidden," she explained, carefully sewing it into the lining of Nora's dress, "where no one would think to look." They worked through the day, checking harnesses and wheels, packing food and water. Arthur's movements were precise but weighted with concern. Each time he passed Nora, their eyes met in shared understanding. This journey would test them all. As the sun rose the next morning, its light caught the melting snow, making the valley glisten like diamonds. Arthur helped the women into the wagon, his hand lingering on Nora's as he steadied her. "Remember," he said softly, "whatever happens, God goes with you." The wagon creaked as they started down the trail, leaving Arthur's cabin behind. Water trickled everywhere as winter's grip loosened, feeding streams that would soon become rushing torrents. The deed rode safely hidden in Nora's dress, its presence a constant reminder of what lay ahead. Arthur watched from his doorway as the wagon grew smaller, his heart pulled between his convictions and his growing care for these women. Especially Nora. The valley stretched before them, beautiful and treacherous in its spring awakening, holding both promise and peril in its melting landscape. The morning light caught the cross atop the new chapel, making it shine like a beacon. As the wagon disappeared around the first bend, its occupants carried not just a hidden deed, but the weight of justice and the test of faith that lay before them all. The wagon wheels creaked along the narrow mountain pass, winding between towering rock walls still draped with patches of melting snow. Ruth held the reins while Nora studied the valley below, searching for any sign of movement. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across their path. "Something don't feel right," Liddy whispered, pulling her shawl tighter. "Too quiet?" Clara nodded, scanning the ridge above them. "Not even birds singing." The first shot cracked through the stillness like thunder. Splinters flew from the wagon's side as more bullets followed. The horses reared in terror, nearly sending them over the edge. "Take cover," Arthur shouted from behind them. He'd been following on foot, leading his own horse. "Behind those rocks, quickly!" The women scrambled from the wagon as bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. Aliyah helped Clara with the horses, leading them off the trail. Arthur reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a white cloth, his hand steady despite the chaos. "Please," he called out, waving the makeshift flag. "We mean no harm. Stop shooting." More gunfire answered him. Elia suddenly stumbled, crying out as crimson spread across her shoulder. Ruth and Liddy caught her before she fell, dragging her behind a large boulder. "She's hit." Clara pressed her hands against the wound while Elia's face went pale. Hoofbeats thundered closer. 6 riders emerged from the rocks above, led by a man whose face mirrored Arthur's, but harder, marked by greed and bitterness. Isaac Stoltzfus reined his horse to a stop, looking down at his brother with contempt. "Still hiding behind your holy weakness, Arthur?" Isaac's voice carried clearly in the mountain air. "Just like when we were boys." Arthur stood his ground, the white cloth held high. "There's no need for violence, brother. These women have suffered enough." "They suffered because they were foolish," Isaac spat. "The railroad's coming through that valley whether they like it or not." His eyes narrowed. "Where's the deed?" "We don't have it," Nora called out, but her hand unconsciously touched her dress where the paper was hidden. Isaac noticed the gesture. He smiled coldly and gestured to his men. 2 riders dismounted, grabbing Nora before anyone could stop them. They dragged her toward Isaac's horse while Arthur watched helplessly. "Brother, please," Arthur's voice cracked. "This isn't the way we were taught." "That's why I left," Isaac sneered. "The world doesn't run on prayers and good intentions." He pulled Nora onto his saddle. "Search the wagon," he ordered his men. They ransacked their supplies, throwing food and blankets into the mud. Finding nothing, they hitched the wagon to one of their horses. "We'll find that deed," Isaac promised, holding Nora tightly as she struggled. "And when we do, you'll learn what real power looks like." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's ride!" The raiders galloped away with Nora and the wagon, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. Arthur sank to his knees in the muddy snow, his white cloth now stained with his sister in Faith's blood. "Lord," he prayed, his voice barely a whisper, "give me strength, not for revenge, but for courage to do what's right." Behind the rocks, Elia's breathing came in sharp gasps as Clara tried to stop the bleeding. Ruth tore strips from her petticoat for bandages while Liddy cradled the wounded woman's head. "The bullet went clean through," Clara reported, her hands shaking, "but she needs proper care soon." Arthur rose slowly, his face lined with grief and determination. He moved to help tend Elia's wound, his gentle hands belying the storm of emotions behind his eyes. "He was your brother once," Liddy said softly, watching Arthur work. "What happened to him?" "Pride," Arthur answered, carefully binding Elia's shoulder, "and the belief that might makes right." He paused, looking down the trail where Isaac had disappeared with Nora. "I failed him then. I cannot fail again now." "What will you do?" Ruth asked, touching his arm gently. Arthur's eyes held a quiet resolve as he finished tending to Elia. "First, we get her somewhere safe. Then—" He took a deep breath. "Then we trust in God's justice, not man's vengeance." Elia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "The deed," she whispered. "It's still safe. They didn't find it." "Rest now," Arthur soothed, checking her bandages one final time. "We'll need all our strength for what lies ahead." The group huddled together in the shadow of the mountains, their mission now more desperate than ever. The morning sun continued its climb, indifferent to the violence that had shattered its peace. Arthur's white cloth lay in the mud beside them, a testament to faith tested and the price of choosing peace over power. Night settled over the mountain cabin like a heavy blanket. The kerosene lamp cast flickering shadows across Elia's pale face as she shivered beneath 3 quilts. Blood had soaked through her bandages twice already, each fresh dressing a reminder of their desperate situation. Arthur sat beside her bed, his large hands folded in silent prayer while Ruth worked to stem the bleeding once more. "She needs a real doctor," Ruth whispered, pressing fresh cloths against the wound. "The bleeding won't stop completely." Across the room, Liddy paced like a caged animal, her boots marking a steady path on the wooden floors. She whirled suddenly, pointing an accusing finger at Arthur. "This is your fault," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "If you'd fought back, if you'd done something besides wave that useless white flag." Her voice broke. "Now they have Nora, and Elia might die, and it's because you wouldn't lift a finger to stop them." "Liddy," Ruth cautioned, but the younger woman wasn't finished. "Your own brother is evil, and still you do nothing. What kind of man are you?" Arthur absorbed her words without flinching, though each one struck like a physical blow. He looked down at Elia's face, watching her struggle for each breath. The weight of their suffering pressed down on his shoulders until he could barely breathe himself. Standing abruptly, he moved toward the door. "I need air," he managed, stepping out into the night. Fresh snow was falling, silent and steady, erasing their tracks from earlier that day. Arthur stumbled forward until his knees gave way, sinking into the soft drifts. His breath came out in visible puffs as he raised his face to the dark sky. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I am lost. These women trusted me to protect them, and I failed. My brother—" He choked on the word. "Isaac has chosen darkness, and I don't know how to reach him anymore. What if Lydia's right? What if my peace is just cowardice?" Snow gathered on his shoulders as he knelt there, remembering his father's weathered face in the lamplight of their Pennsylvania barn so many years ago. He'd been just a boy then, angry after bullies had beaten him at the creek. "Peace isn't weakness, son," his father had said, gentle hands showing him how to calm a frightened horse. "It isn't doing nothing. Real peace takes more courage than throwing a punch. It means trusting God's justice when everything in you wants revenge." The memory washed over Arthur like a cleansing rain. He thought of Isaac's mockery, of Nora's terrified face as she was taken, of Elia's blood staining the snow. Violence had caused all of this. More violence wouldn't heal it. "Show me the way, Father," he prayed. "Not my will, but thine." As if in answer, the clouds parted briefly, revealing a scatter of stars. Arthur rose slowly, brushing snow from his clothes. He understood now what he had to do. He would face Isaac, not with a gun or with hatred, but with truth and the law's authority. His brother needed to see that real strength lay in justice, not power. When Arthur returned inside, Ruth had finished changing Elia's bandages. The bleeding had slowed, though fever still flushed her cheeks. To his surprise, Elia's eyes were open, watching him with quiet understanding. "You found your answer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur sat beside her, taking her frail hand in his. "Yes," he said softly. "I know what I must do." "Without violence?" Her fingers tightened, slightly around his. "Without violence," he confirmed. "There has been enough of that." A faint smile touched Elia's lips. "Then I still believe in you, Arthur Stoltzfus. God's way is not always easy, but it is right." Liddy had stopped pacing, watching their exchange from across the room. The anger had drained from her face, leaving only exhaustion and worry. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice smaller now. "First light. I ride to Fort Collins," Arthur said firmly. "The law must hear what Isaac has done. They'll send marshals." "That could take days," Ruth interrupted. "What about Nora?" I believe Isaac won't harm her while he searches for the deed, Arthur replied. He knows it's his only leverage. We must trust in God's timing. Eliah's grip on his hand weakened as she drifted back toward sleep. Trust, she murmured, like the snow, covering all our footprints, making everything new. Arthur watched as she fell into an uneasy slumber, her breathing finally steadier. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a reminder of grace and of the long path ahead. He settled in for his vigil, ready to watch through the night, his heart at peace with the choice before him. Arthur rose before dawn, his movements careful and quiet so as not to wake the sleeping widows. His left arm throbbed where a bullet had grazed him during yesterday's ambush, but he forced himself to focus on the tasks ahead. The morning air bit cold and sharp as he made his way to the barn, frost crunching beneath his boots. His horse nickered softly as he entered, steam rising from its nostrils in the dim light. "Easy there, old friend," Arthur whispered, running his hand along the animal's neck. "We've got important work today." As he tightened the saddle straps, Clara's voice startled him. "You can't go alone." She stood in the barn doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. "The others are awake too," she continued. "We've been talking." Arthur turned to find Ruth and Liddy joining her, their faces drawn with worry. Inside the cabin, Eliah still fought her fever. "It's suicide," Liddy said, her earlier anger replaced by fear. "Isaac's men will shoot you on sight." Arthur adjusted the stirrups, his movements deliberate. "They won't," he said quietly. "Isaac will want to face me himself." Ruth stepped forward, clutching something to her chest. "At least take this," she said, holding out his worn leather Bible. "For protection." A small smile touched Arthur's lips as he accepted the book. "The best kind," he agreed, tucking it into his saddlebag. "I'll bring Nora back," he promised, "and your land will be restored. Trust in the Lord's timing." "But what if—" Clara started. "Watch over Eliah," Arthur interrupted gently. "Pray for us all." He mounted his horse, grimacing slightly as the movement pulled at his wounded arm. The bandage Ruth had wrapped showed white beneath his sleeve. The widows stood together, their breath visible in the cold air as Arthur guided his horse toward the trail. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink, casting long shadows across the melting snow. The day stretched before him as he rode, the trail winding down from the highlands toward the valley. Spring's thaw had turned much of the path treacherous, mud and slush replacing winter's firm footing. Arthur kept a steady pace, knowing he couldn't risk his horse foundering. Near midday, he came upon a farmer struggling with a broken wagon wheel. The man's mule team stood patiently in their traces while he fought with a broken spoke. Arthur reined in. "Need a hand, friend?" The farmer looked up, squinting. "Much obliged, stranger. Wheel caught a rock back there. Been trying to fix it near an hour." Dismounting, Arthur examined the damage. His blacksmith's eye noted the clean break, the way the wood had split along its grain. "I can help," he said, reaching for his tools. Working together, they removed the wheel and repaired the spoke. Arthur's skilled hands made quick work of it, though his wounded arm protested. As they finished, the farmer offered him bread and cheese in thanks. "God puts us in each other's paths for a reason," Arthur said, declining the food with a gentle smile. "Be well, friend." Back in the saddle, Arthur pondered the encounter. Even in darkness, light found ways to shine through. Perhaps there was hope for Isaac yet. The afternoon sun had begun its westward slide when Arthur finally caught sight of the town. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he could hear the distant ring of the smithy's hammer. His brother's men weren't hard to spot. 3 riders posted outside the saloon, rifles across their saddles. Arthur drew his horse to a stop at the edge of town. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his father's teachings settle around him like a mantle. Violence bred only violence. Peace required the greater courage. Leaving his horse ground-tied near the church, Arthur began walking toward the saloon. His boots left clear prints in the muddy street. A few townspeople stopped to stare, no doubt wondering at the sight of an unarmed Amish man approaching known killers. The guards tensed as he drew near, hands moving to their weapons. Arthur kept his own hands visible and his pace steady. His heart beat strong and sure, fear replaced by a calm certainty. This was God's path. "I've come to see my brother," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Tell Isaac that Arthur is here." The men exchanged glances, uncertain how to handle this unusual threat that wasn't really a threat at all. Finally, one disappeared inside the saloon. Arthur waited, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Its golden light caught the mud puddles and made them shine like mirrors. Somewhere inside, Isaac would be deciding how to handle this unexpected reunion. The saloon's batwing doors creaked. Arthur stood calmly, unarmed and unafraid, as his brother's shadow fell across the porch. The saloon's interior dimmed as Arthur stepped through the swinging doors, his eyes adjusting to the smoky haze. Isaac lounged against the bar, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. The room fell silent. Cards paused mid-deal, whiskey glasses frozen halfway to lips. Nora stood in the corner, guarded by two of Isaac's men, her eyes bright with defiance despite her obvious fear. "Well, if it ain't my holy brother," Isaac drawled, pushing away from the bar. His voice carried across the crowded room. "Come to preach at us sinners?" Townsfolk pressed against the walls, sensing the tension building between the brothers. Sheriff Wallace stood near the back, watching intently but making no move to intervene. "No preaching today, Isaac," Arthur replied quietly. His calm voice seemed to fill the space more completely than his brother's mocking tones. "Just truth." Isaac barked out a laugh, pulling a folded paper from his vest with a flourish. "Truth? Here's your truth. A legal deed to that valley, signed and witnessed." He slapped it down on a nearby table. These women's claims were never valid. Arthur reached into his coat, movements slow and deliberate. Isaac's men tensed, but he withdrew only a blackened scrap of paper. "Interesting," Arthur said, laying it beside Isaac's document. "Because this fragment Nora saved from the burning matches the original deed exactly, except for the signatures." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as several men leaned forward to look. Even from a distance, the difference was clear. The charred piece showed different handwriting than Isaac's supposedly legitimate document. "Sheriff," Arthur called, never taking his eyes from his brother, "I believe that's proof of forgery." Sheriff Wallace stepped forward, boots clicking on the wooden floor. "That's a serious accusation, Stoltzfus. Got any witnesses to back it up?" "5 widows who saw their husbands murdered protecting the real deed," Arthur answered. "The trapper who passed through last month. And the bullet that wounded Elia matches those your deputies pulled from the other victims." Isaac's face darkened. "You always were weak, Arthur, hiding behind laws instead of taking what you want." His hand drifted toward his gun. "Some problems need simpler solutions." "No." Arthur shook his head. "Violence already cost 5 good men their lives. It ends here." "It ends when I say it ends," Isaac snarled, drawing his revolver with frightening speed. Everything happened at once. Nora broke free from her guards, running toward Arthur. Isaac's gun swung toward her. Without hesitation, Arthur lunged forward, placing himself between them just as the shot cracked through the air. The impact spun Arthur halfway around. His shoulder exploded in pain as the bullet struck, but he remained standing. Behind him, another shot rang out, Sheriff Wallace's, and Isaac's gun clattered to the floor. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff commanded Isaac's men. "Anyone moves, they'll meet the same fate as their boss." Arthur swayed slightly, pressing his hand against his bleeding shoulder. Through the haze of pain, he looked at his brother, now disarmed and surrounded by deputies. "Peace wins," Arthur whispered, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "It always does, if we let it." Nora rushed to support him as his knees buckled. "You fool," she said softly, tears in her eyes. "You wonderful, brave fool." The townsfolk stirred, someone calling for the doctor. Sheriff Wallace personally collected both deeds, comparing them in the lamplight. "I've seen enough," he declared. "Isaac Stoltzfus, you're under arrest for murder, fraud, and attempted murder of your own brother." As deputies led Isaac away, the man's arrogance finally cracked. He looked back at Arthur with something like wonder, or perhaps regret. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk your life for them?" "Because every soul has worth," Arthur answered simply. "Even yours, brother." The saloon remained silent for a long moment after Isaac disappeared through the doors. Then, one by one, the townsfolk approached Arthur. Some offered handkerchiefs for his wound, others helped him to the doctor's office. Their respect was palpable, not for any act of violence, but for the courage it took to stand unarmed for what was right. Nora kept her arm around Arthur as they walked out into the evening air. "You know," she said, "I think I finally understand what true strength looks like." Arthur managed a small smile, despite his pain. "It looks like faith," he replied. "In God, in justice, and in each other." The setting sun painted the muddy street with golden light, transforming even the smallest puddles into mirrors of heaven's glory. And in that moment, peace had indeed won its quiet victory. Arthur's eyes fluttered open to sunlight streaming through the infirmary window. His shoulder throbbed beneath clean bandages, but the pain felt distant compared to the joy that filled his heart at the sight before him. All 5 widows surrounded his bed, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Nora's warm hand clasped his, her fingers trembling. "You saved my life," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "We thought we'd lost you when that bullet struck." "God's grace protected us all," Arthur replied softly, squeezing her hand. Through the open window, he could see the jail across the street. Isaac stood at the bars, watching silently, his proud bearing replaced by something more humble. Their eyes met briefly before Isaac turned away, shoulders slumped with the weight of his sins. Sheriff Wallace strode into the infirmary, a stack of papers in hand. "Well, Mr. Stoltzfus, looks like you're healing nicely." He held up the documents. "Just signed these myself. The valley's officially restored to its rightful owners. These ladies can go home whenever they're ready." "We should prepare to return," Arthur said, trying to sit up. "The spring planting won't wait forever." "You're not going anywhere alone," Ruth declared firmly. "We'll all go together once you're strong enough." The other women nodded in agreement. Clara and Liddy had already gathered supplies from the general store, while Elia, her own wound healing well, sorted medicines from the doctor's stock. 3 days later, their wagon rolled slowly through the melting snowdrifts. Ruth's clear voice lifted in hymns that echoed across the awakening wilderness. Arthur sat propped against blankets, pale but smiling as he watched his newfound family. Elia's bandaged arm was healing clean, and she pointed out early wildflowers to Nora, who kept glancing back to check on Arthur. The valley welcomed them home with tender green shoots pushing through the last patches of snow, promising new life and fresh beginnings for them all. The chapel bell pealed bright and clear across Arthur's homestead as spring sunshine warmed the Colorado highlands. 6 weeks had passed since their return, and the land flourished with new purpose. 5 neat cabins dotted the valley below, where the widows had built their homes within sight of the chapel's white cross. Vegetable gardens stretched in orderly rows behind each dwelling. Children's voices rang out from the small schoolhouse where Nora taught reading and arithmetic to 12 orphans from the nearby mining camps. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she guided small hands across slate boards. In the forge, Arthur worked carefully despite his healing shoulder, showing 3 boys how to shape horseshoes from glowing iron. The steady rhythm of hammers echoed across the yard, mingling with hymns from the chapel, where Ruth led afternoon prayers. Near the kitchen garden, Aliyah knelt in dark soil, gathering herbs for the evening meal. Her wound had healed clean, leaving only a scar and a deeper appreciation for life's precious gifts. Clara and Liddy hung wash on lines between young apple trees, their laughter carrying on the breeze. As dusk approached, they gathered around Arthur's table, no longer bare and lonely, but laden with fresh bread and stew. Lamplight cast warm shadows on faces that had grown dear to one another. Arthur bowed his head, his quiet voice strong with gratitude. Lord, from ashes you built beauty. From strangers, you made family. From grief, you brought joy. We thank you for your mercy. The first drops of spring rain pattered against the windows as the widow's gentle laughter filled the cabin. Where silence once ruled, love now made its home, proving that faith could rebuild what violence destroyed. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.